we're taking a look at. A very interesting week in rugby news, including Eddie Jones, Gerry. Was it 6 weeks, I think, after he left his England post? He's now back as the Australia head coach, not just for the World Cup coming this year, but for the next World Cup cycle. It appears he's going to have a very expanded role with Australia, where he'll be working with the women's team as well. And we had Keith Wood on this morning's OTB AM, and he was saying there had to be that possibility that Australia were already in contact about what could have happened beyond the next World Cup. And maybe this was just a situation where they knew that Eddie Jones was possibly there, knew what the situation was going to be like, and once that decision was made about Dave Rennie, they were ready to make the move pretty quickly. Yeah, and you could see why from a number of aspects for Rugby Australia this added up. Number one, he's an Australian and Dave Rennie isn't. Number two, he's very quotable, he hogs headlines, he will increase the profile of rugby union at a time when they've had a tough run of it in terms of results. And I've been to Australia a good few times, and you know, you have to be there to appreciate how much of a battle it is for rugby union against Aussie rules and rugby league. Like, it's way behind, and in certain parts of Australia, cricket as well. Yeah. And it's way down. It's even more of a minority sport in Australia, rugby union, than it is in Ireland. It struck me the last time I was in Sydney. I picked up the paper, and there were stories about the Melbourne Soccer Club, which were running ahead of rugby union. Football as well. So like, they're at a low ebb, and they need the profile, and he will increase the profile, there's no doubt about it. And he could well give them a short-term lift. And we know what kind of rugby he likes to play. It's basically beat the opposition into submission first and foremost. Rugby game is physical brutality and so forth, and we're going to impose physical brutality in the French, which I don't think is the kind of language head coaches should be using in the modern climate. You wonder if when Charlie Ewells got that first minute red card for his high hit on James Ryan, were they just too pumped up to try and do a number in Ireland physically? I don't like a lot of the other things he said in the past, but Johnny Sexton in particular, never mind the scummy Irish and the thing he said about Wales. And I mean, I know, like, I'm going to Six Nations launch, you and I were talking about it off air next Monday, and it will certainly be duller without Eddie, because he was always stirring it up, and he was very mischievous, and he was great value. I'd say the English media lads are thinking, okay, we've got rid of Eddie Jones now, but we've got Steve Borthwick. Nice lad, Steve, but they're not. Maybe not so good for the columnists. They're not better warm up their pen. They won't be getting as many back page leads to the sports editors, put it that way. Absolutely, But then, of course, manna from heaven, you couldn't make it up. There's a possibility of England and Australia meeting in the quarterfinals in Marseille, so you can imagine what that week would be like. I'd say Steve Borthwick will hardly get a mention. Eddie will hog it all week long and will stir it up and be at his mischievous best. And of course, we're guaranteed Warren Gatland and Michael Check in that half of draws. Like all these old heavyweight coaches, you know, plenty to say, and don't mind using press conferences for exchanging the odd barber too. So, but I do think in the midst of all, there's one last thing about this. I think it's really tough on Dave Rennie. And I read all the reports in the Sydney Morning Herald and others just to get a feel, because I was writing a column about it. And he was just like short shrift, the lowest win ratio of any Wallabies head coach. 38%. 38%, and that was it. Nothing else. Now, in 2022, just gone, they came with one very contentious Matthew Ronaldo decision of beating the All Blacks. They came within one brilliant Damien Penaud try of beating France in Paris. They very nearly beat Ireland, as we saw. And it wasn't Dave Rennie's decision to take on 5 matches on an end-of-year tour, to take the tally to 14. It was Rugby Australia took on the 5th match because they needed the money. On foot of which, the 3rd game was against Italy. So really, Rennie didn't have much choice but to rotate a squad, have a good few other players, and they had a kick to beat Italy in the last kick of the game as well. Like, their win ratio could have been easily so much higher this year. But the other thing that really struck me, I did a lot of the Aussie media gigs that week, and how much the assistant coaches and the players, right up to Nick White after the Ireland defeat, like, we are 100% behind Dave Rennie. And they proved it the following week when they were 21 points down against Wales, 14th test of the year, most of any team in World Rugby last year, 21 points down, flight home to Australia the next day. They could have just so easily given up, and they came back and win. And that for me was proof that they were very much behind Rennie. So I think whatever about Wayne Pivac and Eddie Jones losing their jobs, I feel very sorry for Dave Rennie. I think he was harshly treated myself. I've always liked and admired his coaching style from the Glasgow days, and Glasgow won a Pro 12 playing exhilarating rugby, which I rarely use in the same sentence as the URC. although I'm coming around, but they
actually Pivac played a very similar brand with Clonettley, and he went into Wales and probably similar fortunes, well backed by the players, didn't quite get the win ratio in results. I fully agree with Gerry on the notion that it's not purely based on rugby, in that it's based on a bit of a battle for
hearts and minds.
Yeah. The Aussie,
and he is literally as Aussie as they come. And I fully agree. I think he's going to generate attention that they badly need, whereas Rennie is a understated,
or low key,
quieter man. But I'd be interesting to see how deflated those players are, who maybe felt they were really getting somewhere and improving, because Eddie will not have anything remotely similar in approach or in personality when he comes in. He's also someone who's very easy to change his mind, it seems. At one stage he was quoted as saying it takes 8 years to win a World Cup.
8 months is all he has now.
Yeah, so but he's also coming around and says, well, I can actually do it in 8 months now that I'm in Australia. But the high paying RFU he needed eight bites of the cherry potentially, or 8 years to develop that squad that he can now do in 8 months. So he's a little contradictory,
but never short of confidence.
Never, and he is a bit of box office. But it'd be interesting. Sometimes squads really buy into a coach, and when the coach is gone, there's a hangover. And then if the new coach doesn't come in and hit the ground running, there's a little bit of looking over your shoulder and thinking what could have been with the last fella and so on. And look, professional sport is ruthless and unforgiving, and things change very quickly. Generally, players fall into line, but I'd have a sense he's not always had huge reputation in terms of the sense of, I suppose, cohesion in a squad. There's always, he's a Marmite type. They love him or they really don't like him. And the
turnover in assistant coaches was quite extraordinary.
Huge,
over 20, I think it was,
huge.
At England.
Borthwick was my captain in Bath, and he used to do 10 to 12 hour days as a player, video analysis, and an unbelievable line out.
Was this stuff he was asked to do himself, or was it
voluntary?
Right.
He was killing us all because the coach would look what your captain does. No one else was hanging around for additional 5 hours. But apparently he went up to Sarries about a year or two later and worked with and under Eddie Jones, and Eddie Jones is the only person who he's never been outworked by anyone. Borthwick outworked him in terms of time at the desk and analysis, but Jones is someone who really has a strong work ethic despite the characteristics of being a bit of box office. He works bloody hard, so it'll just be a very interesting shift in the Australian approach, I think, and also in that lead up to the World Cup, it'll be fun.
That's interesting.
You'll also have to find an out half in your position, because Bernard Foley did not have a good tour. I don't know whether that sojourn to Japan has taken the edge off his game. Quade Cooper was one of about 20 players who were injured as well. He had an injury that's the length of your arm.
Yeah.
But Eddie Jones needs to develop one of the out halves or somehow find one, because it's such a key position, and they've been struggling there this season.
Yeah.
So bring you back in the Borthwick point. That's interesting, because sometimes players will say, I knew a player towards the end of his career absolutely cut out to be a coach. That sounds like you had a feeling that Borthwick was going to go into coaching at some point. Yeah,
he always struck me as an integrator more than this visionary. I'm surprised that I am, that he went and won a premiership with Leicester as the head guy. I always thought he'd be a forwards coach, an assistant coach, or someone who'll integrate and do all the right processes, but he's not inspirational, he's not a visionary. And, I'm a Liverpool fan. Klopp, to me, is a visionary, and Pep Linders integrates processes, and, great coaching teams need that. I think Farrell is a visionary. When you look at, I would say Schmidt was probably more like Borthwick and has more integrated processes, but maybe not your visionary CEO.
You need a Mike Cat then to...
Yeah, and I think, so it is interesting. I think Borthwick is of that ilk, but he's been made the top guy, and he's been made the top guy on the back of winning a premiership with Leicester. But having known him and played under and seeing that approach he takes, sometimes that's not the approach a team needs from their top person. They need that approach from the 5 or 6 people underneath the top guy. So yeah, I am surprised he's been appointed that job. He's the polar opposite to Eddie's personality. Like you said, Gerry, it's going to be a very different. You can imagine the robotic press conferences that are going to come, and that's nothing wrong with that. He's perfectly entitled to hold his guard, which he will. But yeah, I'm a huge work ethic, a brilliant person, very, very respected and admired by his peer group. But he never struck me at the time like someone who would go on to be the top man. He struck me as an assistant, yeah.
That was a highlight from Gerry Thornley and Andy Dunne, who were in flying form this evening on Wednesday Night Rugby. If you want to see more of the guys, ultimately we had to cut this back. It went over 50 minutes. We went way over time. You can do so by going to the OTB Rugby podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to hear some more from the guys, here's another video option with Andy and from Gerry from this evening's show.